Before the federal election back in 2015, our Assembly of First Nations released Closing the Gap, Federal Election Priorities for First Nations in Canada, a plan to start closing the gap, the unacceptable gap in the quality of life between First Nations and Canada, a gap that still impacts every single Canadian. Our goal was to make sure that every candidate understands First Nations priorities. Our goal was to shape the dialogue around the First Nations agenda and Canada's agenda throughout the election and through the next 4 years. Looking back in the last 4 years, I believe we had some significant progress and impact. We saw the government enshrine in law the need to protect First Nations languages and children. We are seeing support for new approaches to education designed and driven by First Nations. We are seeing work being done on a new fiscal relationship between First Nations and the federal government based on predictability and sustainability. There is much work to do, but there is movement and momentum. Today, I'm releasing Honoring Promises, 2019 Federal Election Priorities for First Nations in Canada. Honoring Promises. I believe that honoring promises sets out the next steps that we need to take as First Nations, as governments, and as a country. We want all Canadians, regardless of their political affiliation, to understand that First Nations priorities are really Canada's priorities. And so we must start with a commitment, first of all, to Mother Earth, to our natural world, and a promise to the next 7 generations. Climate change, climate destruction is the #1 issue facing all of us. Look at the flooding in First Nations along the Great Lakes, right here in Ottawa. Look at the fires in Brazil, and we sometimes call them the lungs of the earth. Look at the hurricanes. Look at what happened on the East Coast with Hurricane Dorian. Things are changing, no question, throughout the world. But it's not time for despair. It's time to plan wisely for the future. And it's time we act immediately, because it's the only planet we all have. First Nations must be first responders in this global emergency. We set out a number of clear commitments. It's time for action, action that incorporates Indigenous knowledge. We have to develop a vision of environmental stewardship that is global and holistic, that takes us beyond existing targets and timelines towards a sustainable future for our children, grandchildren, and beyond. We must promise to build a new economy, an economy for the future of our planet. We have to promise to care for the lands that feed us and renew our original promise to one another to mutually share and benefit from the lands and resources. This means living in keeping with what we've been taught and our promise to one another, to share and work together as partners based on mutual recognition and mutual respect. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples sets out the minimum standards necessary for the dignity, survival, and well-being of Indigenous peoples throughout the world. It says that all impacted parties need to agree on any proposed project or development before it begins, and if it proceeds, it does so in a way that respects our rights and our traditional territories. And that's a good thing. That's called being good neighbors. Upholding that standard would prevent the conflicts and court cases we're seeing today. It would ensure everyone is treated fairly, and it would lead to greater economic prosperity for everyone. Canada must lead in upholding the United Nations Declaration. So we expect the next government to implement the UN Declaration through legislation that is at least as strong as Bill C-262, which died in the Senate. This is about upholding our rights, rights that are too often recognized but not respected. And here I just want to say that we're all treaty people, and we have a treaty relationship with the Crown. We have a treaty with the Crown. I don't have a treaty with the Conservatives, or the Liberals, or the NDP, or the Greens. We have a treaty relationship with the Crown. And we have to see that being honored and implemented according to the spirit and intent. We also say that this is about justice for First Nations people. We want sweeping reforms to Canada's legal system so it truly becomes a just system and not just a court of laws. Our people are too often denied justice. I think of Colton Bushy. I think of John Stiers. We need sweeping changes to ensure justice and legal systems address racism and discrimination. It is simply unbelievable that Indigenous people represent about 30% of all adults in custody, while representing about 4% of the people in Canada. So our plans call for a promise to restorative justice. Even steps like designating First Nations policing as an essential service. Ensuring more First Nations people are appointed to all levels of the court, including the Supreme Court of Canada. And we are calling for the next government to acknowledge and affirm that First Nations laws as equal to common law and civil law. We must promise to the next generation that we are committed to health, education, and attachment to their families, traditions, and nations. First Nations youth need equal opportunity to excel in math and science, history, the arts, and skills and trades. And they must be inspired to have the opportunity to speak their languages, live their cultures, and attend their ceremonies. So as we implement the new law protecting Indigenous languages, we must do it right. Honoring promises is about building a stronger country through healthy and educated First Nation citizens living in communities where every one of our citizens, men, women, two-spirited, transgender, everyone feels safe. A country where the calls to justice of the final report of the National Inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission are all fully implemented. It's our time to commit to action to save our planet and ourselves, to commit to ensure all children are equipped to build a prosperous future, and to commit to a promise that health, education, the economy, and justice systems will work for everyone. The plan we call Honoring Promises points the way to real transformative change, and we say the time to act is now.